I've never been afraid of water. I was afraid of what sinks in it. That night, when my own daughter pushed me into the pool, I discovered how much silence weighs. And what I did next? Silenced the party and opened up our story in a way I never imagined possible. My name is Helena. I'm 72 years old. I've lived in Sydney for over 30 years, but sometimes I still dream in Portuguese and wake up thinking I'm in Brazil. I'm the mother of two girls, Julia, the oldest, who is now 45, and Luisa, the youngest, who is 40. When their father passed away, he didn't die, he just decided the three of us were too much for his dreams. I became a patchwork of everything: mother, father, lap, beans, notebook, and whatever else was needed. I took on 2 jobs. In the mornings, I cleaned offices in the CBD, among skyscrapers that reached the sky as I scrubbed the floors. In the afternoons, I cared for the elderly at a retirement home in Bondi Junction. I took buses in the dark, when Sydney was still asleep, and I walked the deserted streets with trepidation, but with more determination than fear. I stumbled across my English during the first few afternoons, when the city still didn't know me by name, and I pronounced water as water, making the Centrelink employees smile with pity. I remember one particular afternoon, 3 months after arriving. I was in line at the IGA supermarket in Marrickville, with the girls clinging to my legs like my little translators. Julia, then 15, was helping me count coins to pay for milk and bread. The cashier, an Indian boy with a thick accent like mine, looked me in the eye and said in Portuguese, "It'll be okay, madam. Everyone starts over here." I almost cried right there, among the shelves of canned goods and the promotional posters I couldn't yet read properly. I tried to be whole, but I wasn't whole. At night, when the girls slept in our tiny Dulwich Hill apartment, 2 bedrooms that could fit a life and a half, I would sit on the balcony and watch the lights of Sydney twinkle like low-hanging stars. I wrote letters to my mother in Brazil, telling her that everything was fine, that the girls were adjusting, that my English was improving every day. Necessary lies so she could sleep peacefully on the other side of the world. Julia grew up fast. Too fast. I asked her to babysit her sister because I couldn't afford a babysitter, because I didn't know any trustworthy neighbors, because my English wasn't yet good enough to explain emergencies over the phone. And who would babysit Julia? This question haunted me every night. I watched her trade notebooks for grocery lists, dolls for pots and pans, afternoons in the park for grocery lines during Thursday sales. I watched my little girl learn to tie her hair without asking for help and, at the same time, bury within herself the things that couldn't be put into words, fears that were too big for a teenager to carry alone. She learned to forge my signature for school meetings I couldn't miss from work to attend. She learned to cook pasta with canned sauce while I came home at 8 o'clock at night, exhausted, with the smell of disinfectant on my hands and guilt in my chest. Growing up is expensive, and she paid dearly. She paid with the childhood I should have protected, with the weekends that should have been spent playing, with the lightness every child deserves to carry. Luisa was different. Younger, more protected by Julia, she was able to be a child a little longer. But even she learned early not to ask for what we knew we couldn't give. I remember her, at 7, looking at the toy store windows in Westfield and saying, "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to buy a doll for every day of the week." She didn't ask. She dreamed big, like someone anchoring the future in the present to avoid drowning in lack. The years passed like pages turned by the wind. Julia finished high school working part-time at a coffee shop in Newtown. Luisa went to university with a scholarship she earned studying by lamplight when the power went out at home. Both became strong, independent women, but they carried the scars of those hard early years in Sydney on their shoulders. I grew old watching them grow from afar, because working 2 jobs means always arriving or always leaving, never fully present. I grew old with pride in the women they became and guilt for the price they paid to get there. If this story touched your heart, please like it now and share it with someone who needs some comfort. Sometimes, a small gesture helps a big story continue. For my 70th birthday, Julia wanted a big party. She had prospered in life. She became a marketing manager at a tech company, lived in a beautiful house in Leichhardt, and had 2 young children who called me Grandma Lena. She wanted to celebrate, to show the world, and perhaps herself, that we had one. She wanted friends, music, a backyard barbecue, a pool, the lavish table our table never had. I thought it was too much. "Julia, honey, birthday parties are for kids," I said, sitting in her kitchen, drinking tea from cups that cost more than my first salary in Australia. "I just want you to, a simple cake, good conversation." But she insisted with that determined way she inherited from me. "When we decide something, no wind can knock it down. Mom, you deserve it. You always threw parties for everyone and never had one for yourself." And she was right. I'd thrown them birthdays all those years, even when money was tight, even when the cake was boxed mix and the decorations were flowers I picked from the neighbors' yards. But I accepted her party. Maybe it was a chance for us to laugh on the same page, to celebrate together instead of just surviving together. Weeks before the party, we had an argument. A nasty one, the kind that leaves scars that take a long time to heal. It was about money, as always. Louisa had lost her job, downsizing at the company where she worked as an architect, and was struggling. I wanted to help, but my pension barely covered my own bills. Julia offered to help her sister, but made comments about financial responsibility and life choices that cut like knives. "You don't understand, Julia," I said, my voice rising higher than I intended. "You've forgotten what it's like to not be sure you'll be able to pay the rent at the end of the month. You've forgotten what it's like to choose between medicine and food." "I didn't forget, Mom," she yelled back. "How could I forget? I was there. I was a child and I ran the house like an adult. I remember everything, every overdue bill, every night you cried because you weren't listening, every time we ate pasta for dinner because that's all we had. Money that never arrived. Promises that failed. Visits that hurt because they brought back memories we'd rather keep hidden. I said words that couldn't fit in a hug, things about sacrifice, about gratitude, about how she didn't understand the weight I'd carried alone all these years. She held back answers that weighed more than a yes, things about a lost childhood, about responsibilities that weren't hers, about how I'd transformed my pain into hers. The argument ended with slammed doors and broken hearts. We went weeks without speaking, communicating only through Louisa, who served as a bridge between 2 shores that seemed increasingly distant. On the day of the party, I woke up early. It was a Saturday in March, autumn slowly arriving in Sydney. I was wearing a new blouse, a light blue one Louisa had given me for Christmas, and my heart was worn, bruised from the fight that still hung between us like a heavy cloud. I arrived at Julia's house at 4 in the afternoon, carrying my contribution, Brigadeiros I'd made that morning, a sweet attempt to rebuild bridges. The house in Leichhardt seemed larger with the mingling of voices, the coming and going of footsteps, the laughter of those who don't yet know that night sometimes decides to change the subject. The backyard was decorated with string lights, the kind that create a magical atmosphere even in the simplest moments. The pool glistened in the afternoon sun, reflecting off the leaves of the jacaranda tree that shaded part of the deck. The esky was full of ice and beers, waiting to quench my friend's thirst. The skewers on the grill gave off that smell that announces a meeting, that tells me life is happening here, now, in this backyard, among these people. Children ran around in flip-flops, drawing roots on the ground that I could no longer reach with my 72-year-old legs, but that my heart still tried to follow. Mrs. Clark, our neighbor of decades in Dulwich Hill, came especially for the party. She brought a dish, lasagna made with the recipe her Italian mother had left, and a hug that smelled of lavender and fond memories. "Helena, dear, you don't look 72, she said, taking my hands in hers, stained by the decades but still warm. "You have the energy of a woman of 50. Miguel, a long-time friend I met in an English class for immigrants at the community center, arrived with a smile that opens the door to your heart. He brought his guitar, he always brings his guitar, and a bottle of red wine he saves for special occasions. "To the most beautiful birthday girl in Sydney," he said, offering me a kiss on the cheek that made me blush like a teenager. Everyone said, "I'm so proud of your daughter," Helena. And it was true. I watched Julia circulate among the guests, serving drinks, adjusting details, making sure everyone felt welcome, and I saw in her the woman who had overcome what I couldn't. She had built a beautiful life, a loving family, a home where people wanted to be. And I also saw the exhaustion I'd caused, that way of always taking care of everyone, of carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, of not knowing how to say no when someone needed help. On the cake table, the photos hung with clothespins told stories about us without asking permission, the three of us in Bondi on a windy Saturday, with disheveled hair and wide smiles, a picnic in Centennial Park with a blanket borrowed from Julia's friend, surrounded by ducks and memories, our first Australian winter wearing coats donated by the local church, Julia still in her school uniform, too serious for her 16 years, Louisa looking at everything as if discovering the world. With that curiosity she never lost. A cake with the number 70 made by Julia herself. She had learned to bake by watching YouTube videos, another skill she acquired out of necessity that turned into love. Lamingtons bought at the Australian bakery on the corner. Anzac biscuits that Mrs. Clark had taught her to make. Our Brazil Australia, our way, a blend that only we knew how to season properly. And I, in the middle of it all, trying to understand how life draws maps with the same steps we take with fear. How we get here, in this beautiful backyard, after so many borrowed backyards, so many houses that were never completely ours. If this story touched your heart, please like it now and share it with someone who needs some comfort. Sometimes, a small gesture helps a big story continue. The afternoon flew by. Conversations flowed, and the barbecue was served. Sausage, picanha, chicken, even some vegetarian options for Julia's younger friends. The background music played an eclectic mix. Bossa nova for me, Australian pop for the kids, classic rock for those around Sue Miguel's age. I sat in the chair Julia had decorated especially for me, a regular garden chair transformed with ribbons and flowers into a birthday throne. From there, I watched. I watched my grandchildren playing in the pool under the watchful eye of their parents. I watched Louisa chatting animatedly with Julia's colleagues, finally relaxed after tense weeks of job hunting. I watched Julia herself, beautiful in her floral dress, trying to be the perfect hostess but carrying the weight of our unresolved argument on her shoulders. Then it was time for the speeches. Julia tapped a spoon against her wine glass and demanded attention. The yard gradually quieted, conversations dying like waves on a beach. She began by talking about me, about my courage, about how I had sacrificed everything to give them a better life in Australia. My mother, she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion and perhaps the wine, is the strongest woman I know. She brought us to a new country without speaking the language, without knowing anyone, with 2 young daughters and a heart full of hope. Heartfelt applause filled the courtyard. I smiled, waved, feeling proud and embarrassed at the same time. But there was something in Julia's tone, an undercurrent of something unsaid, as if the beautiful words were just the surface of deeper waters. Then came the spark. Mr. Miguel, perhaps a little too much on the wine, made a joke about the hard old days and how now we were all rich and famous. It was an innocent joke, but it hit right where the heart was still bruised. Our discussion about money, about responsibility, about the weight of the past on the present. I replied too briefly, something about how some people forget where they came from. Julia replied with too many years, commenting on how some people use the past as an excuse to not see the present. Our eyes met the wrong way, not with love, but with all the accumulated hurt of the past few weeks. The music seemed to be playing in another yard. The conversations faded. People began to notice something was happening between mother and daughter. And the water was there, glistening in the sunset lights, as if waiting for us to fall. "Mom," Julia said, coming closer to me, "do you always have to ruin everything? Can't you, for one night, just enjoy it? Spoil?" I stood up from my decorated chair. "Am I spoiling it by reminding you where we came from? How much it cost to get here? No one has forgotten." Her voice rose. "But you act as if we were eternally indebted, as if we could never be happy because happiness was too expensive." The backyard was silent now. Even the children had stopped playing in the pool. It was as if everyone knew they were watching something intimate unfold in public, something that should have happened behind closed doors but that fate, or wine, or the pressure of years of unsaid things, had brought to light. It was quick. A touch on my shoulder, a stumble on my heel, and the world turned to water. Afterward, I never knew if it was intentional or accidental, if she pushed me in anger or if I tripped on my own wounded pride. But the result was the same, me falling into the pool in front of all the guests, in front of my grandchildren, in front of the neighborhood that had known me for decades. Underwater, the noise fell silent. Everything became a blue hum, as if the world were an aquarium and I were inside, looking out through the distorted glass of the surface. The light above danced like a memory, as if someone was shaking a curtain of light. And I don't know if it was a hallucination from the lack of air or if it was life flashing before my eyes, as they say it does. I saw 8-year-old Julia, her knees scraped from the Marrickville sidewalks, running after me at the bus stop and saying, "Mommy, stay with me for 5 more minutes." I wanted to stay. But the clock always speaks louder to those who fear missing the last bus. And it hurt, as if time were pulling my foot down. I saw her at 15, doing homework at the kitchen table while heating dinner for her sister, asking, "Mom, when are you going to be home tomorrow?" And I always answered, "Earlier, honey. I'll be home earlier tomorrow." A lie I told her and myself, because earlier never came when you worked 2 jobs in 2 parts of town. I saw her at 20, graduating from college, searching for my face in the audience and finding only 1 empty seat because I was working an extra shift to pay for her graduation dress. I saw the disappointment in her eyes turn, over the years, to understanding, and understanding turning to something harder, resignation. No one jumped first. Not out of malice. Out of fright. Because they didn't know what to do when the situation deviates from the expected social script. Who jumps into a pool to save someone at a birthday party? Who breaks politeness protocol by diving in with their clothes and shoes on? I climbed up alone. I swallowed bleach and spat out pride. Water dripped down my light blue blouse, the pretty blouse that was now heavy and transparent, but it was inside that the cold entered. The stares filled the room. Some burned with embarrassment. Others warmed with compassion. Some shone with morbid curiosity. And amidst all these gazes, Julia's, the glass still in her hand, white as paper. In her eyes, 2 things I recognized from afar, regret and fear. Regret for what had happened, intentional or not. Fear of what I would do next, of the scandal I might cause, of how that party, which should have been perfect, had become a public display of our private pain. I trembled inside. The body ages on the outside first. The heart sometimes takes a while to accept that it can still learn another way to beat. And there, wet and humiliated in front of everyone, I had an epiphany. Not a dramatic revelation like in the movies, but something quieter. The realization that this moment could be the end of everything or the beginning of something new. If you've made it this far, comment on the word water. I'll read it and respond. This helps the channel and keeps these stories alive. I could leave there offended, humiliated, carrying that hurt for the rest of my life and creating a permanent rift between me and my daughter. Or I could use that water, literal and metaphorical, to wash away something that had long needed washing. I tapped my spoon against my glass twice. I picked up the spoon Julia had dropped when she saw me falling, and called for silence. It came heavy, like a wet towel. Everyone knew something important was about to happen. I could feel it in the atmosphere, in that way people hold their breath when they sense they're about to witness something significant. "I want to talk while I'm still wet," I said, my voice coming out firmer than I'd expected. "Maybe it's time to wash our memories away." The yard fell completely silent. Even the jacaranda tree seemed to hear it, its leaves stopping their dance in the light afternoon breeze. The birds that always make noise at dusk fell silent. It was as if the city of Sydney itself had paused to listen. I looked at my daughter and searched for the first day I called her an adult. It was at 15, when her father left, and I said, "Now you're the woman of the house too." A responsibility she shouldn't have been given, a childhood I stole unintentionally, without choice, but which I stole anyway. Sometimes we get used to rushing and forget the way back. We get so used to rushing that we forget what it's like to stop and breathe, what it's like to look into the eyes of the person next to us, what it's like to truly be present. Julia, I began, my voice gaining strength with each word. I made you an adult when you were still drawing on the bathroom tile. Remember? You drew little houses with chalk, little houses with gardens, with white picket fences, with a whole family. And I took you from that drawing to put you in real life before your time. Tears began to stream down her face. They weren't pretty movie tears. They were tears of recognition, of shared pain finally being named. I gave you too much work and not enough support. I gave you bills to pay and forgot to give you time to dream. I brought you to a new country to give you a chance, and without meaning to, I also gave you weight. I gave you the weight of my decisions, my difficulties, my fears. I took a deep breath. The smell in the yard was a mixture of chlorine, barbecue, jacaranda, and something indefinable that was pure human emotion. I made a mistake out of love, out of fear. And fear, my daughter, shakes the hand of someone who just wanted a hug. Fear makes us hold on too tightly, demand too much, charge too much. Because when we're afraid of losing, we turn love into a chain. I stopped, looking at all the faces around me. Some were crying too. Mrs. Clark held Mr. Miguel's arm. Julia's grandchildren approached, curious, sensing something important was happening even though they didn't fully understand what. I wanted to say that the bills wouldn't wait, that the rent wouldn't forgive, that my body wouldn't rest. I wanted to explain the sleepless nights, the constant fear of not making it, the pressure of being alone and responsible for 3 lives in a foreign land. But none of that changes what was missing. None of that changes the hug I didn't give because I arrived late, the conversation I didn't have because I was too tired, the hug I didn't offer because I was so overwhelmed with bills. If you ever felt pushed into life by me, I continued, looking directly into her eyes, today I felt the taste of that push. It hurts. It hurts knowing that life pushes us when we don't jump alone. It hurts knowing that one day I was the one who pushed you, even though I wanted to protect you. Julia covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders trembled. And for a moment, she was back to that 8-year-old girl who just wanted her mother to stay for 5 more minutes. I took a deep breath. I smelled barbecue, chlorine, and rosewood. I smelled life happening, even in the midst of pain. And I continued. I forgive you for the push. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt. It hurt my skin, my pride, my heart. But I don't want to live drenched in resentment anymore. I don't want the water that should refresh us to become a lake where we drown in resentment. I looked at all the guests, who watched in respectful silence. I want to dry in the sun of our new beginning. I want the water to take away what is heavy and bring back what is light. I want to go back to being a mother without being a pressure. I want to go back to being a daughter of the love I feel for you, not a slave to the fear of losing you. If this twist reminded you of someone, send this video to them now. Sometimes, the bridge begins with a click. I took off my wet blouse and spread it on the table, like a white flag. Not of surrender, but of truce. A declaration that the war between us was over, that it was time to build peace. I asked someone to turn down the music. I called Julia to come to the edge of the pool. She came slowly, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. I knelt. Not out of weakness. Out of respect for what was missing. Out of reverence for the love that had always existed, but had been lost amidst so much survival, so much struggle, so much fear. I grabbed the photo album from the dashboard. I flipped through the pages with fingers that had held too much of the world, fingers that had held babies, mops, immigration documents, bus steering wheels, small hands crossing busy streets. I read quietly the dedications I never wrote, the letters I never sent, the words of love that got stuck in a throat too busy shouting practical instructions. And then I pulled a still damp piece of paper from my wet pants pocket. It was the letter I'd never sent. A letter I'd written years ago, on one of those many sleepless nights when guilt outweighed exhaustion. A letter I carried in my wallet like a talisman, a promise that one day I'd have the courage to deliver it. The letter was stained with pool water, but the words were still legible. I read it aloud, so everyone could hear, so that nothing would remain unsaid between us. Daughter, if the world weighs you down, remember, it was in my chest that you learned to sleep. It was in my lap that you discovered there is a safe place in this world, even when everything outside seems haunted. If I weighed too heavily on your life, forgive me. I only knew how not to fall. I didn't know how to dance with the wind. I only knew how to weather the storm. My voice was shaking, but I continued. Today I fell into the pool, in front of everyone. Tomorrow I want to fall into your embrace, hours alone. I want to fall into your laughter, into your forgiveness, into your company. I want to fall to my knees before the miracle of having created such a strong woman, even though I made so many mistakes in the process. I handed the letter to my daughter. She was trembling. So was I. We both trembled like leaves in the wind, but it was a different kind of trembling. It wasn't the trembling of fear or anger. It was the trembling of someone on the verge of healing. Give me your hand, I said. And I gave mine. Our palms met, wet, mine from the pool, hers from the tears dripping from her fingers. I got into the pool again. This time, voluntarily. It wasn't punishment. It was baptism. It was the ritual I needed to perform to wash not only the chlorine from my skin, but also decades of misunderstandings, swallowed words, and postponed hugs. May the water take what we no longer need, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, and return what we forgot to care for. Julia stepped into the pool with me. In a dress, in shoes, not caring about the expensive clothes or the running makeup. People, someone would later say, even stopped breathing. Some wept. Others closed their eyes as if witnessing something sacred. Mrs. Clark whispered a prayer in Italian. Mr. Miguel let a tear run down his bearded face. The children watched with that pure curiosity only they possess, knowing something important was happening even without understanding all the layers. For a moment, the city breathed with us. All of Sydney stopped for a second, or at least that's what it felt like there, hugging my daughter in the water, both of us wet, both of us finally honest, both of us finally whole. There, wet, we promised to learn slowly. We promised to make better mistakes. We promised to speak before we sank. We agreed that words would once again live among us, without shouting, without hiding. And that haste, that noisy neighbor of fear, would no longer rule our table. Mom, Julia whispered in my ear, cuddling me in the warm water of the pool. I also ask for your forgiveness. I grew up angry that I grew up too fast, but I forgot to be grateful that I grew up strong. I forgot that you did the best you knew how with what you had. And I forgot, I replied, that you were a child, not a partner in the survival enterprise that has become our family. We both laughed. A wet laugh, salty with tears, but genuine. It was the first time in years we'd laughed together without burden, without agenda, without rushing to finish to resolve something urgent. When we finally emerged from the pool, the guests applauded. It wasn't the polite applause of a social gathering. It was an applause of recognition, of those who had just witnessed something real, something that perhaps reminded each of them of the bridges they needed to build in their lives. The party continued, but with a different energy. The conversations deepened. People hugged more. Some guests approached me to share their own stories of reconciliation, or to say they were going to call someone they missed. It's funny how one person's courage sometimes gives other people permission to be brave too. The next day, the sun rose behind the red rooftops of Leichhardt, filtered through the leaves of the jacaranda tree that had witnessed our reconciliation. I woke up at Julia's house. She had insisted I stay, not drive home after such an intense night. The coffee steamed in the kitchen. I made crooked pancakes, the way I always do. I never learned the secret to perfectly round pancakes, but I did learn that imperfection can also be a hallmark of love. Julia laughed at my crookedness. I laughed at our rightness. The newspaper lay forgotten on the table as we chatted about nothing and, eventually, everything. We talked about our early years in Sydney, about the fears each of us kept hidden, about the dreams we postponed to deal with the urgencies of everyday life. "You know what I missed most, Mom," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Talking to you without an agenda. It felt like we only talked to solve problems, to organize things, to decide practical matters." It was true. Somewhere along the way, we had transformed our relationship into a business, where I was the family CEO and she was the operations manager. We'd forgotten about being simply mother and daughter. The letter dried on the window, in the morning sun. The sorrow, in time. It's curious how some things need water to clean, and others need time to dry. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice the details that rushing steals. The distant rumble of the train heading from Leichhardt to the city, a reminder that life goes on, but it doesn't have to always be rushing. The street children practicing an English that no longer stumbles, a new generation of immigrants finding their voice in the land that also welcomed us. The neighbor watering the plants at the time when the sun likes to play with shadows, creating patterns of light and darkness in the yard. And my daughter, my Julia, watching me with a care that unapologetically exists, unburdened by obligation or guilt. We began to develop new rituals. Breakfast on Tuesdays, for no particular reason other than the pleasure of each other's company. Walks in Leichhardt Park, where I finally learned the names of the Australian birds that sing differently from those in Brazil, but are just as beautiful. We returned to places we'd captured in photos. We went to Bondi on a windy Saturday, and I saw that the sea, no matter how big, respects those who learn to breathe. This time, I didn't worry about the weather. I didn't calculate how much parking would cost, or if we should have brought snacks instead of buying them on the beach. This time, I allowed myself to simply be there, feel the sand between my toes and listen to my grandchildren playing in the shallow water. We went to Centennial Park with a blanket that was ours this time, a blanket Julia had bought especially for our picnics, red and white checkered like the ones in American movies. We took the ferry to Manly on a random Thursday afternoon, for no special occasion, just because we could. During the crossing, I rested my head on her shoulder without asking permission, as if saying I'd finally learned the way back home. And home, I realized, isn't just where we live. Home is where we can let our guard down, where we don't have to be strong all the time, where we can be human without explanation. We stopped by Glebe Market on a Saturday morning and picked out flowers that didn't need to be apologetic. We bought flowers because they were pretty, because they smelled good, because we deserved to have beauty on our table without it being extravagant or wasteful. Life, when it wants to, writes a new story with the same letters. It uses the same characters, the same settings, but it changes the script, the tone, the ending. Louisa got a new job at a sustainable architecture firm in Surrey Hills. On her first day, the three of us had lunch together to celebrate. Julia, Louisa, and I. It was funny to realize that for the first time in decades, we were coming together not to solve a crisis, but to celebrate a victory. "You two look different," Louisa commented, looking from me to Julia. "You look more light." And it was true. There was a new lightness between us, as if we'd taken a heavy backpack off our backs and discovered we could walk faster, breathe deeper, laugh louder. I'm 72 years old and I'm still learning. I'm learning that forgiveness doesn't erase scars, but changes their color. Where they were once purple with pain, they are now golden with wisdom. Forgiveness illuminates. It shines a lamp over our scars and lets us choose what to do with the shadow they cast. I learned that courage, sometimes, is simply not running away from what needs to be said. It's standing your ground when everything inside you wants to run away. It's opening your mouth when silence seems safer. It's extending a hand when pride insists you cross your arms. And love isn't about winning the argument. Love is about staying when the argument is over. Love is about helping sweep up the broken pieces, bringing water to wash the wound, not keeping score because it understands that no one wins when the heart loses. Julia and I, we are still together. Sometimes we stumble over our words, old habits die hard, and there are still times when I want to give unsolicited advice or she wants to solve problems that aren't hers. Other times, we tread firmly so as not to overturn the good memories we are building on top of the bad ones. But now, when the water shines, whether in her pool, in the Bondi Sea, or simply in the glass of water we share at a coffee table, we are not afraid to fall in. We dive in carefully and emerge hand in hand, because we've learned that it's not the depth that drowns, it's the weight we insist on carrying alone. And weight, when divided, becomes a bridge. It becomes a crossing. It becomes the path that connects two shores that seem to be on different continents. If someone pushed you to a place that hurt, maybe there's a way back. It can start with a short letter, like the one I carried in my wallet for years. With one simple word: sorry, miss you, love. With a forgive me said in the size that fits in your mouth right now, without needing to be eloquent or perfect. It doesn't have to be pretty like in the movies. It needs to be true. It needs to fit in the hands of the listener and the speaker. It needs to be said at the right time. And the right time, sometimes, is when we finally find the courage, not when the circumstances are perfect. That's how we started over. That's how the party fell silent that night, not out of shame, but out of respect. Out of reverence for what was being born there, in front of everyone, in the chlorinated water of a swimming pool in Leichhardt. Today, when I tell this story, people ask me if I regret doing all that in public, if it wouldn't have been better to have a private conversation, without an audience. I always say no. Sometimes we need witnesses for a miracle to happen. Sometimes we need the world to see our courage so that it becomes real, definitive, irreversible. And maybe, who knows, our courage to sink to save ourselves gave others permission to do the same. Maybe Mrs. Clark called the son she hadn't spoken to in months. Maybe Mr. Miguel wrote the letter he'd been putting off for years. Maybe some of the bridges built that night extended far beyond our backyard. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. Leave a comment with a word you would say to someone you love. I'll pin the most beautiful ones and respond as many as I can. If you know someone who needs to hear this, please share. Sometimes, a bridge begins with a click. And a bridge, when well cared for, lasts longer than a push. And if you want to hear me say it again, I'll say it again. I've never been afraid of water. What drowns us isn't the depth. It's the weight we carry alone, the weight of unfulfilled expectations, of words unsaid, of hugs not given, of forgiveness not asked for. And what I did that night, in front of everyone, was learn to let go of the weight. It was learning to swim again, not with my arms, but with my heart. It was discovering that sometimes, sinking is the only way to truly learn to float. Today, when I look back, I see that 70th birthday party was the true beginning of my adult life. It was when I stopped just surviving and started living. It was when I discovered that it's never too late to apologize, never too late to change, never too late to choose love over fear. And that a pool, no matter how simple, can become the sea where we finally learn to sail hand in hand with the one we love. See you in the next video. See you soon.